Okay, I think I'll get started, and I want to start, again, it's Heather Bullock. I'm the executive lead for RISE. I started officially in September, so I'm excited to be in this new role and to be working with all of you over the coming months and years. I first wanted to start by thanking you for joining us today. Having spoken with many teams this week, I know that this is one of the crunch weeks for those invited to full applications, and so we really appreciate you making the effort to be with us today. So what I'm going to do is go through some basic content, some principles and ways we think about community engagement and communication, and turn it over to our panelists after that. I wanted to mention that this is the fourth in a series of 6 webinars that RISE has put together in response to particular needs that we've heard from the teams moving to full application. Pressing issues that they wanted to discuss more, hear more about, and stay tuned. There's another one that's coming Monday, as well as in October. And I wanted to mention that this particular webinar is in response to requests received within our online community environment, where we asked folks what do they want to hear more about or discuss. And so this webinar is a result of people putting their hand up and saying we'd like to have a discussion more about community engagement and communications. And so that's why we're here today. I think probably part of the reason why folks felt like it was important to have this discussion is that really the full application is highly focused on community engagement as a core component of what Ontario Health teams need to deliver on. And so on this slide, you'll see that first quote is directly taken from the preamble of the full application. And they're really thinking about engagement in terms of the patient declaration of values for Ontario, as well as a comprehensive community engagement approach. On the application itself, there are some discrete sections that speak to this, but also, as you see there, they've really encouraged teams to think about how they can sprinkle community engagement throughout all of their responses. So this is an important criteria for the ministry, and it's based on the understanding that to really have this transformative effect that Ontario Health teams have the potential to have, you need to be working together as a community, almost at a population level with your attributed population, to get those gains that are that we have the potential to get. In terms of the way RISE thinks about this, it relates to what we've called Building Block 3, and Building Block 3 has 2 components to it. The first, which relates to that patient declaration of values, is patient partnership. This webinar is not specifically about patient partnership. I think that deserves at least its own webinar, if not a series of webinars. But I wanted to just briefly run by you what we mean by patient partnership. So patients might be too narrow of a word. It really is there to describe the involvement of patients, families, and caregivers throughout the Ontario Health team work. That includes in governance and leadership positions, and we know that, for example, some teams have patient co-chairs of the OHT itself. Others have them leading working groups and, across all of the different decision-making tables that they've put into place so far. They're also really critical in that shift toward a population health management approach, and in particular, understanding patient population needs and experiences of care so far. So what are the needs, what are they getting or not getting, and how can we improve services to better meet the needs of patients and families and caregivers. And in doing so, this is really how the OHTs can meet that new patient declaration of values for Ontario, where they expect equal and fair access to the healthcare system and services for all, regardless of language, ethnicity, race, or location within Ontario. So again, this is critically important, but this is all the time I'm spending today on patient partnership, and we will be doing more work with some experts to ensure that you have a more in-depth look at what patient partnership means and how the different teams have been operationalizing that in their work in the future. The second building block is where we are focused today, and that is on community engagement. And so the difference that we're making between patients and community is that community engagement is really about engaging with diverse groups. And these come from different diverse communities. And again, the engagement needs to be thought of in terms of decision making, but also in planning, design, governance, and the delivery of services. So throughout the activities of the Ontario Health teams. What I think is a really unique opportunity, given the emphasis and focus that the ministry has put on community engagement, is this really gives us another opportunity as a system to reflect on who has been participating in our decision-making structures and at different levels, and to inspect whether or not there are voices that we haven't had at the table that need to be heard if we really want to do a better job of creating a system that's more accessible and supports better outcomes for all Ontarians. So the idea here is this phase of planning that we're in with the OHTs provides an opportunity for teams to include those voices that aren't typically heard. And we think about community engagement in 3 different ways. So what is good community engagement? Well, it's about building relationships with the full diversity of community groups. It's about being explicit about the goal of any given community engagement initiative. And thirdly, it's about being intentional in the design of a community engagement initiative. So there's the relationships, it's being explicit about the goals, and intentional about the design. And so the rest of the presentation, or the bulk of the rest of the presentation, is really going to focus on unpacking each of those elements of good community engagement. So first is building relationships with the full diversity of community groups. Again, we have to start with what is community, and we're operationalizing that in a way that is about groups who share certain characteristics or interests. So that can be about age or sexual orientation, ethnocultural background, language spoken at home, lived experience of a certain condition, et cetera, and whose identities might intersect among these characteristics or interests. So it's fairly inclusive, but it's focused on groups. The reason why we have bolded ethnocultural background and also language spoken at home is because there are 2 particular groups, community groups, that have received specific focus in terms of the Ontario Health Team applications, one being Indigenous groups and another being Francophone Ontarians. So again, we want to provide more specific detail from experts related to engagement with each of those groups. And in fact, our next webinar will focus on engagement with Francophone populations. We're working on getting something together around Indigenous groups as well in the future. But really, it's not just about those 2. We need to think broadly, we need to think at a population level in all of the different ways our communities are diverse. There are varying ways that groups can vary across dimensions. So one of those ways is their level of formality. So is it an informal group? Is it a grassroots community mobilizing type of initiative, or is it a more formal and recognized group? The second is the type of participation. So is it, are people participating in a voluntary capacity, or are they professionals who might be getting paid for their time to participate in OHT-related work? And the third is around how they're funded. So are they for-profit, or so they're profit-taking in a system, or are they not-for-profit? And a lot of times in healthcare, we see quite a bit of not-for-profit activity, although there certainly is for-profit groups who are important community groups to engage as well, and we don't want to miss out on thinking about them too. But there are various other dimensions that community groups can range in that we haven't mentioned here. So that's not the 3 only ways that they vary. So second, we want to be explicit about the goal of any community engagement initiative. And here I've listed some possible goals and the degree of power sharing and control related to them. You'll see that the arrow pointing down just suggests that at the bottom, is a more highly collaborative approach, and at the top is less. But that doesn't necessarily mean the bottom is better than the top. So sometimes the goal of a community engagement initiative is to share, and that's about community groups receiving information about an OHT program or decision in an accessible and tailored way. So that's usually a one-way push from the Ontario Health team out to the groups. That's a really important and critical type of communication that maybe we dismiss, but is foundational to the work of the Ontario Health teams. The second is consulting. So this is where community groups have the opportunity to weigh in and provide input. This is almost the opposite of the first, where it's the community groups to the OHT, and the OHT being more of the listener and trying to incorporate the perspectives that they're hearing from various community groups. The third goal would be a deliberate goal. So this is when community groups help identify the issue and or develop a strategy that the OHTs commit to deliver. So, this is almost taking the second consultation one step further, where there might be a focused conversation of a particular issue where the OHT and the community groups try and find common ground and arrive in an agreement about a way to move forward that then the OHT takes and operationalizes. And then the final is the collaborate goal. And that's really where community groups work with the Ontario Health team to identify an issue, so similar to the deliberate, and to develop and deliver solutions. So that's where it differs. So this is really about shared decision-making and implementation of solutions. So this is probably the most comprehensive way to think about engagement, and it's really about co-ownership with community groups. And we've come to really value co-ownership, but each of these are important in its own right, and it doesn't mean that you need to strive for the collaborate goal at every juncture. So it's matching the need with the goal, with the most appropriate goal of the collaboration. The third part is being intentional in the design of a community engagement initiative. The first way OHT should consider being intentional is around the attitudes, their attitudes about engagement. And these attitudes can be informed by, self-reflection and asking questions like, as an OHT, are we modeling an openness to having stories told and issues reframed, as well as a commitment to inclusivity in who is telling the stories and reframing the issues? So if you think to what I did, back to the previous slide and what I just told you about the possible goals, you can demonstrate this openness with any of those goals. It doesn't just have to be in a fully collaborative co-ownership sort of way. Another way, another question to ask yourselves as OHTs is, are we demonstrating a commitment to being as systematic and transparent as possible in community engagement within the constraints of the decision-making process? This is a tricky one because, as we know, there has not been a long runway for teams to do the work, to get together just within their own organizational structure, get to know each other, and get to a place where they can make shared decisions. And to extend the engagement thinking outside of the team itself to all of those other community groups and organizations and faith-based organizations outside of the health sector has been, I'm sure, very challenging. And from what I've heard from folks, it's been extremely challenging. But I think the key there is the commitment to doing it and being as transparent as possible about what you've been able to accomplish within the constraints and what you haven't been able to accomplish. And if you haven't been able to accomplish certain things that you'd like to, making that a priority after October 9th to get going on those things sooner rather than later. The third question is, are OHTs showing a willingness to adjust their initiative based on the feedback? It's one thing to say that we want input from a particular group, but to have that just fall on deaf ears and not demonstrate a willingness to adjust the programming, the services, or the engagement approaches doesn't demonstrate to the community that the intention is a true one. So this is a question just every once in a while to continue to ask ourselves, are we doing enough around having a feedback loop to our own processes to ensure that input gets fed back and things get adjusted accordingly? And then finally, are we seeing the initiative in part as a way to provide future leadership opportunities for members of underrepresented groups? This, again, might be not something that's at the forefront as you're working to engage communities, but it's certainly an opportunity, again, that the OHTs provide. How can we develop that capacity for leadership? What do underrepresented groups need in order to be engaged and to become leaders and at the table, and how can we enable that as a group? And this is just being cognizant of the power dynamics that exist in a system and thinking through how we can shift them immediately, but also thinking about shifts over time in terms of future leadership opportunities. So the second way that OHTs can be intentional around community engagement is in the design of the engagement initiatives themselves. And so here what I've done is had a few bullet points about the types of questions that can be asked around the design. So this is actually connected to some of the features that our panelists have put into place already in some of their work. So are we clear about the goals of the engagement? Is it sharing? Is it collaborate? Is it deliberate, et cetera? Are we clear about the focus? Are we clear about the relationship to other initiatives? Are we recruiting in ways that respect diversity? How are we really trying to get at those folks who haven't been engaged in our health system and aren't benefiting from the services that we could be providing? And are we providing appropriate supports for engagement? So the supports can range. It's about capacity building, translation. It can be language related. Are we using clear language? Are we writing things? Are we thinking creatively about people who may have visual impairments or challenges with reading and presenting material, perhaps in a verbal way as well? Are we respecting anonymity, or is that important? Can we compensate folks for their participation in terms of expenses and potentially time? And then if you're asking for an engagement around an issue that might evoke particular sensitivities on those you're trying to engage, have you considered things like backup counseling and other resources in case the engagement results in some unexpected stress and burden on the participants? And then finally, are we clear about, are we using a clear process? So do we have some folks who understand how to do engagement effectively? Do we have a facilitator? Do we have clarity about the context and the constraints? Have we created the right format? Have we left enough time? And do we have a good venue that's acceptable to groups? Do we have a way to end the engagement by finding some shared agreement or overlap in terms of next steps? And I just, in terms of this, I think it's really important for us to think outside of our institutional boundaries with health. Where are the folks that we want to engage, and how can we set up things that makes it the easiest as possible for them to attend? So perhaps going to faith-based organizations, other places in community where people gather, and bringing our questions to them instead of expecting them to come up to us for that engagement. And then related to that idea of feeding back in, changing our processes, changing our decisions based on the engagement, are we making appropriate plans for follow-up? So this is about capturing what is learned in a document, sharing it, following up with participants is taken. In my experience with engagement, stakeholder engagement in a number of initiatives in mental health, this is the critical piece that will propel future engagement. If you can demonstrate that the input you've received was heard, was reflected on thoughtfully, and what action steps you've taken. And if you haven't been able to take action steps, explaining why not has been really important in terms of creating interest in future engagement and getting people on board with what you're trying to do. So it's a respectful way of being, of conducting engagement. And then, and more formally to that, are we evaluating the initiatives? So there's various tools out there that you can use to evaluate your community engagement initiatives. We have one that we link to on the RISE site, the Patient and Public Engagement Evaluation Tool. But there are plenty of others out there, and depending on what your goal is with the engagement, you might want to have a look to see what's out there that might be suitable for you to understand systematically whether your engagement has reached the goals that you wanted it to achieve, and did people participating get what they needed or wanted or expected out of it, and if not, why not? So lots of opportunity there for existing tools that you can just use. And again, I would pick tools that are tailored to the type of engagement that you're working on, rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. I've included a slide here on engagement techniques. So this is getting more into communications, I would say. We often think, and I've heard just speaking with teams, that people need to engage through either working groups, work groups, workshops, but there are plenty of different engagement techniques in the literature. Many of them have been evaluated to a certain degree. Some of them are a little bit newer and don't have as much evidence, but just pragmatically, people have found really useful. So I've listed some here. Some of the kind of more traditional ones, some of them are taking advantage of the newer technology. And, one of the things to think about with your engagement technique is, let's say you have a priority population of frail elderly for year one, and you want to do some engagement specifically with some groups that might have an interest or something to say to you in terms of developing the services and service pathways necessary to serve them better. Thinking through what types of engagement they're going to feel comfortable participating in, that will allow them to participate, without being hindered by, say, visual impairments or other things that frail elderly might be experiencing, is critical. Likewise, some groups are focusing on youth, and then again, thinking through how are they used to engaging, how do they like to hear information, and tailoring your engagement techniques to them is equally important. So, I was just at a conference last week, and I had a few instances where someone did like a tweet thread from a little meeting that I missed, and I found it invaluable. It was like the golden nuggets of that 1.5 hour session, and about 12 tweets of 30 characters or less. So that certainly was in terms of just keeping me informed. So that's not going to get you to that collaborative juncture if that's what you're aiming to achieve. But, if one of your goals is just getting information out there, thinking through some creative mechanisms to do that, to keep people up to speed. This is even helpful for folks who are part of your team and who can't necessarily make every meeting, or are on multiple teams and want to stay abreast of what's happening on the 2 or 3 teams that they're supposed to be participating with. So that's it for me for now. I'm going to come back in after we've had a chance to hear from our panelists, who are 2 of our OHT community members. They're from the East Toronto Health Partners team, Tracey Turriff and Erica Maio. Tracey, how are we with your, I noticed that we hadn't sorted out your voice yet, so I'm not sure if we might just hear from Erica or both of you. But I'm wondering if you could just share your perspective on how you're tackling engagement and the communications work you've been doing so far in your OHT.
Great, thank you so much, Heather. So it's Erica here, and Tracey, are you on the line? Well, maybe we're still having some issues with her audio. So maybe I'll just get us started, and then hopefully she can join us. So yes, thank you so much again for having us. So the East Toronto Health Partners. So we were really fortunate early on that we had created several different committees within the East Toronto Health Partners, and they actually invited a communications committee to form to actually to start this work and looking at communications and community engagement. And so during the past few months, we've really had, I would say, a hyper focus on conducting engagement sessions with healthcare providers, primary care, clients, patients, family, really on our priority populations. So currently we have work streams for our seniors and caregivers with a focus on chronic disease, people living with mental health challenges, substance use and addictions, and also priority neighborhoods. And so what we decided to do is to actually embed our communications committee members into every work stream to really ensure that we could stay closely connected to all of this work. So really our community engagement checklist, which I believe is now available on the online community, was really inspired by this need to quickly bring diverse groups of people together in a way that was meaningful and coordinated. So at the center of this, it's really about building trust and foster long relationships. So make people feel and how they can contribute to impact. So I would say with checklist, it's aspirational, and we're learning as we really try to implement all of these things, as we move forward. Sometimes we are under some of these restrictions. Checklist is broken up into. So one is really sort of the strategic planning element, I would say, behind the session. And then the remaining is really about logistics. So this could be anywhere from selecting a venue to, getting your email distribution list ready and your invitations. It can be managing registration, assigning volunteers to support on the day of. And I would have to say personally, I know for me, I've worked in hospital communications for the past 9 years. And so I really, I bring that lens to the work. And I think what has been most fascinating about this experience is really opening your eyes and really learning from your partners and learning best practices. So when we think of engagement, and I know in a hospital setting, it's often, we have these different committees and, people come here to meet us here. And I think what I've learned so much from our community partners, it's really about meeting people where they are. So there's so many people populations that we don't see in the hospital. So, for example, our partners at South Riverdale do really amazing work with community peer workers and connecting people with lived experiences. So, sometimes this could include a stipend, for example, to support their time and efforts to do this. So again, I would say, for us, a really big learning and surely for me has been to really meet people where they are. And then part one of the checklist, I would say, is really about setting those goals and objectives. So Heather really beautifully laid this out and referred to this. I would say, and even, internally here when we work with clients, sometimes they have a tendency to sort of dive right into the tactics and, we have so much to do before really sometimes just taking a quick pause to stop and to clarify, what is it that we actually want to achieve with this and why are we bringing people together? So, this can really go back to those, the 5 W's, why are we doing it? Who do you need to involve? What type of engagement are we looking for? When will you involve others? And how will you engage them? And so today, Heather did talk us through some of the different types of engagement. So the share, consult, deliberate, and collaborate. And of course, just be really intentional about the level of engagement. And I think, in general, another big learning for us, and I think actually Heather may have opened with this in her first slide, was really just defining, what does engagement actually mean? And not only what does it mean, but who does that involve? So when we talk about community engagement, there are so many key players in the realm. So whether that's sector partners, it could be primary care physicians, of course, clients, patients, and families. It could even be, our own staff in our respective organizations. Like, we can't forget to bring those people on this journey with us, because I'm sure they have a lot of questions and we don't want to leave them behind. And then finally, what will you do with the information, and how will you really share that back? So for us, we're discussing, how we're really building out our plans for our priority populations, in the application. And so what we're doing with it is it's actually going, into that application and really trying to ensure that, that process has been one of co-design. And then maybe the last thought I'll leave it with, and hopefully by now Tracey has been connected, but events really, really do take a village. So as you're planning this session, part of, I think, what the checklist really helps to do is just to ensure that you have, all of the right supports in place that day. Because again, I mean, every time you host one of these sessions, it's a reflection of who you are and your reputation. And people are going to take that away, and they're going to share what they've learned and how they're involved. So just, really making sure that it's been a really carefully thought out event, and that people want to keep coming back.
Thank you, Erica. I still don't see that Tracey. I'm just calling out in case somehow you're on, and I don't. See there? Sounds like no. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview of the way that East Toronto Health Partners has been approaching their communications and their community engagement work. And, Tracey, if you have things to add, you can send it into the chat box, and we'll make sure that we read it out to folks. I feel bad, but, technology, some of the downside of some of those strategies, I guess. So, Carrie, do we have any questions or comments in the chat box from folks?
Hi, Heather. We do. But sorry, I was trying to connect Tracey through my phone, as she's still having some problems connecting. Let me just so the first question that we have, and while Erica's answering it, I'll keep trying to work with Tracey. The question that is there is that somebody has never heard of a hackathon and is wondering whether it could be described.
Oh boy. Heather, do you have any knowledge of a hackathon?
I do.
I'm gonna hand that right over to you.
So this is in kind of the more of the innovation space and the design thinking space. Hackathons are used to, it kind of started in I think more of the business world, but to get concentrated work to think through a new solution to a problem. And I've had the experience in mental health with some youth leaders who have led hackathons to come up with alternative ways to deal with transitions from the child and youth mental health sector to the adult sector. And what comes out of those, they often are long. So they'll be, some of them will go just 24 hours straight, and people can come and go a little bit if they want. Some of them will be over 2 days, but the idea is it's almost like a retreat mentality. There's different specific approaches within the hackathon, and I've never led one myself. But just watching how they unfold, it's a really concentrated way to work on a very specific problem and to identify an innovative solution which you then, will build or implement. So that's what that is in a general way. Hopefully that helps. Some of my youth mental health leader partners would be able to tell you even more because they've led them. But that's just my observer experience with them.
Great, thanks, Heather. So I think I have connected Tracey through my cell phone, so I'm going to let her see if we can get her on the phone to provide a little bit of her some of her experience with community engagement so far. So Tracey, can you talk and see if this works?
Yes, hi there. This is Tracey. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yay. Hi, Tracey.
Fantastic. Well, I'm terribly sorry for the technical challenges and that I wasn't able to join you earlier. And due to the challenges, I wasn't able to hear everything that Erica was speaking to earlier either. So I don't want to reiterate a lot of what she was saying, but I guess one piece that I will speak to before we go back to the questions is one of the benefits that we've had in East Toronto is the opportunity for communications to get really involved very early on in the process. The East Toronto Health Partners was formed from these anchor organizations who would actually work together on a number of initiatives over the past many years. And in fact, a couple of years ago, before there was ever any discussion of Ontario health teams, they were working together on some joint partnership initiatives and had started talks to formally kind of formalize that partnership. And so as a result of that, they recognized the importance of involving a number of colleagues and forming some committees for specific work quite early on in this process. And so Erica and I have had the opportunity to work quite closely with some amazing communications experts from representatives from each of the anchor organizations as well as the LIN. And we've been able to come together as a great group to work together on some things. And we've also had the opportunity to have communications embedded and really involved in the work that's happening with the other kind of committee groups as we work forward on engagement and other areas of developing the Ontario Health Team. And I think that's been really beneficial and has allowed us to kind of try to infuse some communications best practices into some of that work. So and learn a lot from the amazing colleagues we have on those other committees along the way. So that's one thing that I think just from a communications perspective as well as an engagement perspective, it's really been helpful, I think, for us to have communications very involved in all areas of the work.
And if I can actually add, I realized at the beginning I didn't say who the anchor partners were for the East Toronto Health Partners. So just if anyone is curious, we are Michael Garron Hospital, Providence Healthcare, part of Unity Health Toronto, South Riverdale Community Health Centre, VHA Home Healthcare, Wood Green Community Services, and we've had immense support from the Toronto Central Local Health Integration Network, Home and Community Care, and we're also working very closely with an emerging East Toronto Primary Care Network.
Thank you, Erica, and I'll just continue on just for a couple more minutes and to speak to a couple of the early initiatives that we did that were really more on this kind of sharing end of the engagement spectrum. We decided to share the self-assessments that we did towards becoming an Ontario Health Team on each of the anchor partner websites with a little note to try to help make sure that partners and health and community care providers in East Toronto were aware of everything that was happening and had an opportunity to engage with us. And similarly, when we were approved to submit a full application, we sent a note out from one of the leaders on behalf of the partnership, similarly, to try to make sure that everyone working in this space in East Toronto was aware of what was happening and sharing the message that we wanted to work with everybody and really engage with them. And then, as I think Erica spoke to pretty thoroughly, we've now been focusing very much on more engagement sessions around our priority populations and making sure we're communicating thoroughly through that. Back to the questions, perhaps.
Thank you, Tracey. That was really helpful, and it was a nice compliment to what Erica said. So don't worry that you were overlapping, because you weren't. You were complimentary. Carrie, are there any other questions?
Yes. So one question came in that is, sorry, I'm just pulling up the file. Thank you for sharing all of your approaches. Do Tracey and Erica have any tools that they have found to be the most effective for engaging with older adults?
Interesting. I think, sorry, I'll just attempt to answer that. This is Tracey here, and then maybe we can speak. Erica can jump in. I think so far our focus has been more around working with some of the clients and caregivers and patients and families who were already working with some of our anchor organizations and through some of the outreach that our anchor organizations in the LIN had been doing in the area. And so those relationships were already somewhat established, and they've already been working pretty thoroughly with us on some of the developing and co-designing of initiatives that we're working on for our priority populations. And so I think we've been able to benefit from those relationships and that established trust that we have with those people, and are familiar, therefore, with the communications that they're very familiar with, making use of personal phone calls from their contacts at some of the organizations, for example, so they understand who they're hearing from and being very clear. As Heather was speaking to earlier about, in broader strokes, about the necessity of being clear about our what we're trying to do, and so on, making sure that's extremely clear for them. And we're looking forward to doing broader community and public outreach going forward once the full application is submitted. And I think I know phone line webinars, I think, is something that we might want to consider, as well as the opportunity for in-person engagement sessions, like open houses, perhaps, town halls, that sort of thing.
And I think that's. Oh, I was going to say, just to add, I think Tracey, those are excellent points, and I think a part of one of the core principles in our OAT is this sort of model and idea of sort of building out that network of networks. And so I think what's been so helpful is that because of all of our partners, whether we come from primary care, home care, acute care, social services, I think what we're really trying to do is, as we go, those sort of rings become larger and larger and larger. And so I think that as we continue to connect and foster those relationships with more of our partners and stakeholders, it will become easier to sort of make the right connections to get the right people.
Great. So Heather, we've had one more question come in.
Okay.
I can put it to kind of Tracey and Erica first, and then it relates back to a lot of questions that we heard during the regional session. So you may also have some kind of input to add here. But apart from creating the East Toronto Primary Care Network, what are some of the other plans for communicating and engaging with primary care physicians?
Good question.
Yeah. Sorry, Tracey, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, I'll start and you can jump in.
Yeah.
So we, in terms of we've been involving primary care in all of the engagement sessions that we've been having. I think over the last few months, we've probably had maybe, 15 or 20 engagement sessions around our priority populations, and primary care physicians have been involved in all of those co-design sessions with us. And then in terms of primary care specifically, and thinking about the establishment of the network for East Toronto, there have been some engagement sessions specifically for primary care themselves as well. There were a couple of information sessions that happened with primary care physicians earlier on over the last couple of months, and I know a couple more are planned over the next month or two.
Yeah, and we have, I believe, it's over 250 plus family physicians, and so I know Dr. Kevin Workington, he's actually been at all of our tables. We have sort of this weekly meeting with our operations committee that Dr. Kevin Workington is plugged into. And so the idea is bringing that information back to this emerging East Toronto Family Practice Network. So that group is actually in the works trying to form this memorandum of understanding and sort of finalize plans to become an official network. And so, as part of that, it will be working very, very closely with this network to really ask physicians, how is it that you want to be involved, and engaged. And I'll say, we're having a community webinar on Monday, September 23rd from 3:30 to 4:30. And, we did actually hear back from some family physicians, and I thought it was excellent feedback. They said, we're delivering frontline care, and it's hard for us to really take time out of our day, to be able to tune in and listen. And so, based on that feedback, for us, it sends a strong message again to really ensure that we are booking sessions that accommodate many people. And so, again, I think that network is going to be really important for us, a key stakeholder to plug into and, to really hear that voice.
I would just add that I think something that you both said earlier around relationships and trust is critical with primary care partners. So, what is the existing relationship between primary care and the rest of, the healthcare sector in your region? Because, I think given the constraints that primary care physicians, nurse practitioners, et cetera, work under, some of them, if there is already a level of trust, are comfortable playing less of a fully engaged role and, seeking very particular opportunities to provide input. Whereas if you haven't developed that level of trust and those, strong relationships, there may be a need to sort out how to engage them more fully earlier. And then if that's the case, given the constraints that they have around delivering care, thinking through how you're timing things, what are the options for participation, is there compensation available? I mean, these are all that we all know that there's no additional funds for OHTs, so those things are very tricky to manage, but these are the considerations. It's important to understand the considerations that primary care practitioners have when they are looking to participate, understanding the parameters and what that would mean in terms of cost benefit for their practice.
And the other thing I'll mention to you, and if anyone is interested, they're welcome to follow up with me afterward. But I do know there's also, it's called a Working Better Together for our patients, and that event is actually tomorrow night. And there will be discussions there about Ontario health teams in the East, specifically for primary care, and more discussions on this emerging network, if anyone is interested.
Great. Carrie, are there any other questions that have come in?
So 2 more questions regarding primary care providers and engaging in them. It's apparently a hot topic. So the first question is, are you finding your primary care practitioners typically from family health organizations, or do you have good cross-section of all patient enrollment types of practices?
Erica, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, well, I guess I want to be perfectly honest. So I personally, I haven't been as closely sort of looped in and involved with specifically the primary care engagement. Most of what I've heard has been a little bit more around family physicians. However, if there were questions after, I'm more than happy to go back and respond and follow up if we're able to share afterward. I don't know if you had any other ideas, Tracey, or if you had been more involved in that.
Well, I think I would just support that. We'd be happy to, if there are questions, this one or any others that we don't have a fulsome answer for, we'd certainly be happy to get it for anyone who would like more information. And I will say that I think, as with everything, and for many of us in this Ontario Health Team world, it's an evolving process and it's a changing process. And I know the East Toronto Health Partners are very committed to being as inclusive as possible. And so I think we are aiming to have primary care physicians from all across different types of practice involved, and I know that's absolutely the goal. And there may be more family physicians now, but I know there's quite a bit of acute care as well, and the intention is absolutely to have everybody involved.
And I'll just put a quick plug in for our own community practice there. If people do have more questions, I think Tracey and Erica were both kind of ready and prepared to speak more about the community engagement side. And if there are questions about primary care engagement, I'd encourage you to post them on the community practice, and we'll see if other groups have answers to these kinds of questions, as I'm sure there are challenges that everyone's experiencing.
The other thing I think I would like to point out is, it's important in terms of the associations that are connected with primary care. They might have some tips and tricks as well, and I know a few of them are working on developing some resources specifically for Ontario Health Teams And we'll make sure that we promote those and connect you to those through our site when they become available. So, you know, I think this is primary care engagement is critically important. It's also challenging. It requires us all to think differently than the way we've been connected already in systems. And so I think guidance from a variety of sources, both just with teams to one another, how they've been handling it, as well as hearing from some of those associations who are really well connected with their members and understand what motivates them and how to connect will be helpful, I think, as well, as soon as they're available. So, you know, stay tuned, and we'll make sure that we're, you know, connecting you with those key resources when they come online. Is there anything else, Carrie, now, or should I just wrap up?
I think kind of maybe introduce the next two webinars and wrap up today's session. Okay. So just to let you know, we've got a RISE brief on community engagement that's available on our site. And we also have a link to, I think we actually have the document, the East Toronto Health Partners Community Engagement Event Checklist that Erica and Tracey were referring to. I just did a screen capture, which you can't read there, but just to tell you it does exist. And, you know, they have graciously, you know, offered to let everybody else beg, borrow, steal it, modify as needed. But it's just a tool that can help you get going, or at least trigger you to think about some things you maybe haven't had a chance to think about in your race to that October 9th deadline. And as Carrie mentioned, there is an upcoming webinar on Monday, which is around engagement with Francophone communities specifically, and, you know, how to work with them to improve care for the Francophone population in Ontario. That's exciting, and we've got quite a few experts that will be joining us as panelists for that and co-presenters. And then our last one for this round is around collaborative governance, and that will be on October 1st, 12 to 1. And we've got some governance experts that we're lining up for that one. So put those in your calendar and stay tuned. And we're really glad you spent your lunch hour today with us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.